You are not my mother. The words sliced through the air at my granddaughter Lily's 18th birthday party, and for a heartbeat, everything stopped. 50 guests froze, champagne glasses hovering midair. The only thing I could smell were the roses on the tables, suddenly sickeningly sweet, like a funeral. Lily's face was a storm of fury. This was the girl I had raised as my own daughter after her mother passed away, and she was looking at me like I was a stranger. Before I could even find my voice, my daughter-in-law Sabrina moved. She slipped through the stunned silence with a chilling little smile and handed Lily a stark white envelope. That's when I saw my son, Lucas, my only child. He just stood there, watching, his eyes completely empty. Lily tore open the envelope. Inside was a DNA test. Sabrina's voice was smooth as poison as she announced to the silent room that they'd discovered a terrible secret. She claimed that Lucas wasn't my biological son, meaning Lily had none of my blood. The story was a masterpiece of cruelty, painting them as victims of a long-lost hospital mix. That moment was designed to break me, to turn me into a confused, heartbroken old woman they could easily control. Little did they know, it was the beginning of a war. They underestimated the woman they tried to erase. My name is Genevieve, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I took back my life. This story isn't easy to share, and honestly, I could use some company along the way. If you want to hear how their perfect plan unraveled, make sure you're following along. You won't want to miss what happened next. The silence after the party was louder than the screaming. One by one, the guests had trickled out, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, their whispers trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. I was left standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration. The half-a-ton birthday cake looked like a ruin on the table, and the scent of roses now just smelled like decay. I felt hollowed out, a ghost in my own home. My son wasn't my son. The granddaughter I adored wasn't my blood. My entire life, my identity as a mother, felt like a story I'd been telling only to myself. That's when they cornered me. Lucas and Sabrina found me in the living room, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of concern. Sabrina sat next to me, her hand on my arm feeling heavy and cold, not comforting. Her perfume, something expensive and sharp, felt suffocating. She told me how sorry she was, how they had carried this terrible burden for years, trying to find the right time to tell me. She said it was a miracle they'd even found out, thanks to a distant cousin doing a genealogy project. Every word was delivered with the polished sincerity of a seasoned actress. Lucas just stood behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets, staring at a spot on the carpet. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was my son. I changed his diapers. I held him when he had fevers. I taught him how to ride a bike. 38 years of memories, and he couldn't even look at me. The pain of that was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. Then Sabrina got to the real reason for their performance. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She told me that, to avoid any more public scandal and to do the right thing for Lily now that things were complicated, it would be best if I signed over her trust fund immediately. The $500,000 my late husband and I had set aside for her future. She said it would show Lily that my love wasn't dependent on blood, a gesture of goodwill to start the healing process. She even had the papers ready, pulled right out of her designer handbag, along with a sleek, silver pen. And the worst part, I almost did it. The humiliation, the grief. It was a tidal wave, and I was drowning. Signing a piece of paper seemed like a simple way to make it all stop, to prove that I still loved Lily, to try and mend this gaping wound in my family. My hand was trembling as I reached for the pen Sabrina was holding out. The metal felt ice-cold against my fingertips. But then I looked up, and I saw it. Just for a split second, Sabrina's mask slipped. Her eyes flicked over to Lucas, and there was a flash of something sharp and greedy in them, a look of triumph. And at the same time, I saw Lucas flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement as my fingers got closer to that pen. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first crack in their perfect, heartbreaking story. A tiny splinter of wrongness that my intuition grabbed onto like a lifeline. I pulled my hand back. I told them I was too distraught, that I couldn't possibly sign legal documents in my state of mind. I needed time to process everything. The annoyance on Sabrina's face was immediate, though she quickly smoothed it over with a pained smile. She said she understood, of course, but urged me not to take too long, for Lily's sake. They left soon after, their disappointment hanging in the air. As the front door clicked shut, the grief didn't go away, but something else rose up to meet it. A cold, hard knot of suspicion. Why the rush? Why push for a signature on the very night my world had been blown apart? Why did a conversation about a family tragedy feel so much like a business transaction? They thought I was a fragile old woman, undone by grief, and I was grieving. But 30 years as an art curator, spotting fakes and forgeries, had taught me one thing. You look for the detail that doesn't fit. You trust your gut when the artist's signature looks just a little too perfect. That night, sitting alone in the dark, I didn't call my bank manager. I called my lawyer, who gave me a name. My hands were still shaking, but it wasn't from sorrow anymore. It was from a slow, burning rage. I had no idea how deep their betrayal went, but I knew one thing for sure. The performance was over, and I was done being a member of the audience. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I moved through my silent house like an automaton, playing the part they had assigned me, the broken matriarch. When friends called, I let my voice crack. I told them I needed time, that I was in shock. When Sabrina stopped by with a container of soup, her face a perfect porcelain mask of sympathy, I let her in. I sat at my own kitchen table, stirring the soup I had no intention of eating, and listened to her talk. She spoke about how difficult this was for everyone, especially Lucas. She mentioned how brave Lily was being, despite her world being turned upside down. Then, she'd gently circle back to the trust fund, suggesting that finalizing it would be a concrete step towards building a new kind of family. Felt a bitter taste in my mouth that had nothing to do with her soup. Holding that blank, grieving expression on my face while my insides were screaming was the hardest performance I've ever given. I just nodded, telling her I was still too overwhelmed to think about finances. I needed her to believe I was weak. I needed her to stay overconfident. All the while, a man I'd never met was quietly working in the background. My first phone call with Daniel Ortiz was brief and clinical. His voice was calm and steady, a rock in the middle of my churning ocean of emotion. I told him the story, my voice a quiet whisper, terrified someone might overhear. I sent him a high-resolution photo of the DNA test that I'd secretly taken with my phone before they left. I gave him the names, Sabrina, Lucas, and Sabrina's cousin. The one she'd mentioned was a tech whiz. Daniel didn't offer sympathy or judgment, he just asked questions. He told me not to do anything, not to sign anything, and that he would be in touch. So I waited. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I paced the length of my living room, the Persian rug my husband and I bought in Istanbul now feeling like a cage. I stared at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Lucas as a little boy on his first bike, his face beaming. Lucas graduating from college, his arm around me. Lucas on his wedding day with Sabrina. Was it all a lie? Had I been blind for 38 years? The doubt was an acid, eating away at my memories. The call came on the third evening. I was staring out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, when my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Donnie. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me he had news, and he asked if I was sitting down. I sank into the nearest armchair, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. He started with the lab named on the DNA report. He informed me in his calm, measured tone that the lab didn't exist. It had a professional-looking website, but it was just a template. The address was a P.O. box that had been closed for 6 months. The phone number went to a burner phone that was no longer active. My breath hitched. It was all a little too convenient, a little too neat. But that wasn't the worst part. Daniel had cross-referenced the design of the report, the specific fonts, the layout of the logo. He then did a search on Sabrina's family, specifically the graphic designer cousin she was so proud of. The man had a small freelance business. On his online portfolio, Daniel found a project file he'd forgotten to password. In it were several drafts of a medical report template. It was a perfect match to the DNA test Lily had opened at her party. The phone felt heavy and cold in my hand. There was no hospital mix. There was no terrible secret. There was just a cheap, cruel forgery cooked up by my daughter-in-law's family. The entire public spectacle, the humiliation, Lily's Panette was all based on a document created on a laptop. The wave of grief I expected to feel didn't come. In its place, something else washed over me. A terrifying, crystal-clear certainty. The kind that freezes you from the inside out. They hadn't stumbled upon a family tragedy. They had manufactured one. And as I sat there in the twilight, the fabricated document was no longer the most shocking discovery. The real horror was the realization that my son, Lucas, had stood there and watched them do it. He had let them aim a dagger at my heart and had done nothing to stop it. The fake test was just a piece of paper. The real forgery was the man I had called my son. Knowing the DNA test was a lie didn't bring me peace. It opened a floodgate of questions that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling. The biggest one was simple. Why? The $500,000 in Lily's trust was a lot of money, but the cruelty of their plan felt disproportionate. To orchestrate such a vicious, public humiliation, to turn my own granddaughter against me with such a devastating lie, it felt like using a cannon to kill a fly. There had to be something else. Something I was missing. The cold knot of suspicion in my stomach told me the lie about the DNA wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The next morning, I called Daniel Ortiz again. The tremor in my voice was gone, replaced by something harder. I gave him a new directive. Stop investigating the forgery and start investigating their finances. I told him to dig into everything their business, their credit, their entire lifestyle. I needed to understand the desperation behind the lie. For a week, I lived in a state of suspended animation, perfecting my role as the grieving recluse. I let my calls go to voicemail. I kept the curtains drawn. I made sure any neighbor who saw me caught a glimpse of a stooped, heartbroken old woman. Inside, I was a coiled spring of tension, waiting for Daniel's next call, the feeling of dread and determination warring within me. I knew the truth, whatever it was, would be ugly. I just didn't know how ugly. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel started with their business, the boutique wine import company that Lucas and Sabrina were so proud of. From the outside, it was the picture of success. They were featured in local magazines. They drove luxury cars. Their Instagram was a curated feed of Tuscan vineyards and expensive dinners. I had always been so proud of Lucas for his apparent success. Daniel's report dismantled that fantasy piece by piece. The business was a catastrophic failure. They had taken out massive loans they couldn't service. They owed money to suppliers, to shippers, to the government in back taxes. They were, in Daniels.com/professional terms, drowning in debt. The fancy cars were leased. The house was mortgaged to the hilt. They weren't just greedy. They were backed into a corner, and they were willing to chew off their own limbs to escape. I felt a wave of nausea. All those years, I'd admired their ambition, when what I was really seeing was a frantic scramble to stay one step ahead of total ruin. But even that didn't explain the personal nature of their attack on me. Then, Daniel said the words that made the blood freeze in my veins. Genevieve, the financial trouble is the motive, but the $500,000 was never the real target. It was just the bait. He told me what he'd found next. Through a contact, he had learned about a consultation they'd had with a notoriously shady lawyer a month before Lily's party. They were inquiring about the process of filing for an emergency conservatorship over an elderly parent. They were building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. Suddenly, every piece fell into place with a sickening click. The public spectacle at the party wasn't just to isolate me from Lily, it was to create a stage. They needed witnesses to my emotional breakdown, my grief, my confusion, my public agony that was going to be Exhibit A in their petition to the court. They would argue that the shock of the DNA news had shattered my fragile mind, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. They weren't after the trust fund. They were after my entire estate, the $2.5 million my husband and I had spent a lifetime building. They didn't just want a piece of my life. They wanted to steal the whole thing, leaving me a prisoner in it, powerless and silent. They were going to use my love for my family to prove I had lost my mind. In that moment, the grief I had been clinging to for a week finally burned away, leaving behind something clean and hard as diamond. The sadness was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a cold, quiet, all-consuming fury. They had dug a grave for me and tried to gently nudge me into it. They were about to find out I wasn't going in. I was going to bury them in it instead. The fury didn't burn me out. It forged me into something new, something sharp and focused. For the first time since Lily's party, I slept through the night. I woke up the next morning not with a heavy heart, but with a clear and singular purpose. The time for hiding and grieving was over. The time for hunting had begun. I was the one who made the call. I dialed Lucas's number and listened to it ring, practicing the tremble in my voice. When he answered, I played my part. I told him I'd had some time to think, and that all the fighting was just destroying what was left of our family. I told him I wanted to talk, to find a way forward, for Lily's sake. I could almost hear the triumphant smile in Sabrina's voice when she took the phone from him, telling me how relieved she was and that they would come over that afternoon. I spent the next few hours preparing my home, but it felt less like cleaning and more like setting a stage. I brewed coffee, the rich smell intended to create a sense of warmth and normalcy that was a complete lie. I put out a plate of cookies I knew Sabrina liked. I sat in my favorite armchair, arranging a soft blanket over my lap, carefully crafting the image of a frail woman seeking comfort. When the doorbell rang, I took one last deep breath and summoned the ghost of the woman I used to be. They walked in radiating a smug, cautious optimism. Sabrina was all gentle touches and soft-spoken words of encouragement, while Lucas lingered by the doorway, unable to look at the family photos on the wall. They thought they were here to handle a fragile old woman. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. I let them lead the conversation. I nodded and sighed in all the right places. I told them that my investigator had found nothing and that I was ashamed forever doubting them. I saw a flicker of relief pass between them. Then, looking as helpless as I possibly could, I told them I was ready to consider signing the papers for Lily's trust. I just had so many questions. I felt so confused by all the legal talk. Sabrina leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. This was her moment. She launched into a patronizingly simple explanation of how the transfer would work. She used small words, speaking slowly, as if to a child. And in her arrogance, in her absolute certainty that she had me completely fooled, she made a mistake. She was explaining how her lawyer would handle the paperwork to make it as painless as possible for me. She was saying how, once everything was filed, they would be able to handle Lily's finances and ensure she was secure for life. Then she got comfortable. She explained that after the initial transfer, they would consolidate things to make them easier to manage. And then the slip came, a single word that hung in the air like a drop of poison. She said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, that it would give them the authority to oversee all related assets to prevent any future instability. She must have seen the flicker in my eyes, because she corrected herself instantly. A little too quickly. She clarified that she meant instability in the market, of course. But I heard it. It wasn't just a word. It was a confession. Future instability wasn't a financial term. It was a psychological one. It was the language they would use in a courtroom to prove I was in. She was no longer talking about Lily's $500,000. She was talking about my entire life's work. She had just shown me their hand. I didn't react. I just sank back into my chair, my face a mask of weary confusion. I told her it was all a bit much for me, that I needed to speak with my lawyer, a nice man named Mr. Chun, just to make sure I understood everything before I signed. I gave them the name of my late husband's estate lawyer, a man who had retired 5 years ago. Sabrina's smile tightened, but she agreed, telling me it was a wise decision. They left my house, convinced I was just a harmless, doddering old woman taking one final, feeble step before surrendering completely. They had no idea that her one careless word hadn't just confirmed my fears. It had given me the final piece of the puzzle. It was the weapon I needed. She had just handed me the script for their downfall, and I was about to write the final act. My first meeting with my real lawyer, Mrs. Chun, was in a discreet office downtown that smelled of old books and quiet power. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who listened to my entire story without a single flicker of surprise. She looked at the evidence Daniel had gathered, the proof of the fake DNA test, the mountain of debt, My report of Sabrina's Freudian slip and nodded slowly. She confirmed my fears, telling me that petitions for conservatorship based on sudden emotional distress were a classic, predatory tactic used to defraud the elderly. But she also gave me a warning. She explained that to truly turn the tables on them, we needed more than just evidence of their intent. We needed to understand the why behind the what. Juries and judges, she said, needed a story, and the story of desperate children trying to get money was common. To make them pay for the full extent of their cruelty, we needed to uncover the root of the poison. She advised me to have Daniel keep digging. I agreed without hesitation. I gave him the green light to go deeper, to find the spark that started this fire. While I waited for his next report, I found myself drifting through memories. I remembered Lucas in his late 20s, brimming with a restless ambition. He was always chasing the next big thing, the shortcut to the life he felt he deserved. I remembered the day he and Sabrina came to me, flushed with excitement, to pitch their wine import business. It sounded glamorous, but I saw the flaws in the plan right away: the lack of capital, the reliance on fickle trends, the sheer risk. I loved my son, but my late husband had taught me to be a steward of our wealth, not a gambler. I had a crystal clear memory of that afternoon a year ago. Lucas had asked me for a loan, a huge, business-saving loan of $200,000. I had refused. I offered to pay for a financial consultant to help them restructure. I offered to help them budget, but I would not throw good money into a sinking ship. He had been furious. He'd accused me of not believing in him, of hoarding the money my husband had left. Sabrina had stood beside him, her face a mask of silent, simmering resentment. The fight was bitter, and it had created a distance between us I'd been trying to bridge ever since. At the time, I thought it was just a painful disagreement. I had no idea it was a declaration of war. Daniel's call connected the dots with brutal precision. He had been digging into their digital trail and found a draft of an email on Lucas's computer, an email he had written to Sabrina the day after I refused the loan. The file was labeled "My Mother." Daniel read parts of it to me over the phone, and each word was a physical blow. Lucas had written that my refusal was the ultimate betrayal. He claimed I was a dragon sitting on a pile of gold that I didn't even need. He wrote that the money should have been his already, and that if I wasn't going to give it to him willingly, they would have to find another way, a way to liberate the family assets from someone too old and out of touch to use them properly. That was it. The real motivation. It wasn't just about their debt. It was about entitlement. It was about resentment. In their minds, I wasn't their mother. I was an obstacle. My refusal to fund their fantasy was the excuse they needed to justify the unthinkable. The plot to have me declared mentally incompetent wasn't a recent, desperate idea. It was a seed planted a year ago. Born of rage and greed, a cold calm settled over me. The last remnants of the loving, misguided son I remembered were gone, replaced by the image of a bitter, calculating stranger. This wasn't just a betrayal born of desperation anymore. I now understood it was a calculated act of punishment. And that changed everything. My counterattack couldn't just be about protecting my assets. It had to be about justice. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to strip me of my power, my voice, and my sanity. To win, I had to do more than just expose a lie. I had to dismantle their entire world. My strategy was taking shape, but Mrs. Chun and I knew there was a critical piece missing. We had the facts, the motive, and the evidence of their plan, but it was all circumstantial. It was my word against my son's. To build an inescapable trap, we needed someone from the inside. We needed a witness who could speak to their manipulation firsthand. We both knew who it had to be. Lily. The thought of pulling her deeper into this toxic mess made me sick with guilt. She was a victim in this as much as I was, her love and trust weaponized by her own parents. But leaving her in their web of lies felt even crueler. She deserved the truth. And I realized, with a heavy heart, that her truth was the most powerful weapon I could possibly have. But I couldn't just call her. Her parents had poisoned her against me, and she would see anything I said as the desperate ramblings of a bitter, disowned matriarch. She had to discover the truth on her own. It was the only way it would stick. With Daniel's help, We put together a package. There was no return address, no name, no letter from me. It was a cold, anonymous manila envelope containing just 3 things: a printed copy of Daniel's report on the non-existent DIL lab, a screenshot of her graphic designer uncle's medical report template from his portfolio, and a single, typed note. The note contained only 2 questions. Who told you the lie, and what did they stand to gain from it? Daniel arranged for a discreet courier to deliver it to Lily's dorm at college, 2 hours away. And then, the hardest part began, the waiting. For 3 days, I was a wreck. I barely ate. I jumped every time the phone rang. I paced my house, consumed by a storm of what-ifs. What if she threw it away? What if she took it straight to Sabrina and Lucas? What if the truth was too much for her to handle? I was second-guessing myself, terrified that my attempt to save her would only cause her more pain. During those long, silent hours, my mind kept drifting back to when she was a little girl. I remembered teaching her how to hold a paintbrush, her small fingers smudged with watercolors. I remembered reading her bedtime stories in the very armchair I now sat in, waiting. We had a band, a real and tangible thing built over years of love and trust. I had to believe that the foundation we built was stronger than the lies her parents had constructed on top of it. On the 3rd night, just as I was about to give up hope, my doorbell rang. It was nearly 10 p.m. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Lily. She was standing on my porch, illuminated by the single yellow light, looking small and lost. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, and clutched in her hand was the manila envelope. I opened the door, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then, a choked sob escaped her lips, and she collapsed into my arms. I held her as she cried, her body trembling with the force of her grief. I brought her inside and made her tea, wrapping her in the soft blanket from my armchair. It took her a long time to be able to speak. She told me how she'd gotten the package and had been too scared to open it at first, but the questions in the note had burrowed into her mind. She looked at the evidence and felt the world tilt on its axis. She had confronted her parents. She reported how they had reacted not with sadness or confusion, but with pure panic and rage. They had tried to grab the papers from her, telling her I was a manipulative old woman trying to poison her mind. They had forbidden her from contacting me, but their desperation was the final confirmation. She saw the truth in their panicked eyes. She had packed a bag and left. She had come to the only person she knew would tell her the truth. As I held my granddaughter, the broken pieces of my heart began to feel like they were knitting back together, forming something stronger. This was the turning point. This was the moment their plan truly began to die. They had used Lily as the sword to strike me down. Now, she was my shield. And standing together, we were ready to become their storm. Having Lily in the house changed everything. The oppressive silence that had haunted me for weeks was replaced by the soft sounds of life-quiet conversations over tea, the low murmur of the television in the evenings. We didn't talk much about what her parents had done. The wound was too raw. Instead, we existed in a space of shared, unspoken understanding. We were 2 survivors, quietly drawing strength from each other, preparing for the final battle. The house was no longer a place of grief. It was a headquarters. Our war council took place in Mrs. Chun's formal conference room. It was me, Lily, Mrs. Chun, and Daniel Ortiz. For the first time, all the pieces were on the table. Daniel laid out the timeline of their deceit. Mrs. Chun outlined their likely legal strategy, and Lily provided the painful, first-hand account of their manipulation. The case against them was a fortress. Mrs. Chun suggested our next move could be to go straight to the district attorney. Daniel proposed we could confront them with a civil lawsuit that would lock them in litigation for years, but I rejected both options. They hadn't come at me with legal papers and quiet filings. They had come at me with a public spectacle, with emotional warfare. A battle fought on paper wouldn't be justice. It would just be business. They started this with a performance, and I was determined to end it with one. I needed to see their faces. I needed them to walk willingly into a trap of their own making, drunk on their own arrogance. I needed their downfall to be as personal and as devastating as the attack they had launched against me. And that's when the perfect stage became clear in my mind. The confrontation couldn't be at my house. That was my sanctuary. It had to be on neutral ground, a place that would make them feel powerful and legitimate, a place where they would believe their victory was just one signature away. I looked at Mrs. Chun, at her polished mahogany table, and her leather-bound law books. This was the place. The plan formed quickly, each of us adding a crucial layer. We would lure them here, to this very office, under the ultimate pretense. My complete and total surrender. I would be the one to call them. I would play the part of the defeated mother, telling them that after Lily's return, I realized I would do anything to put my family back together, even if it meant giving them what they wanted. I would tell them I was ready to sign the papers not just for Lily's trust, but the other documents they'd been preparing to manage my estate. I would tell them my lawyer, Mrs. Chun, would oversee the signing to ensure everything was final. It was the perfect bait, an irresistible fantasy of their ultimate triumph. Daniel and Mrs. Chun handled the logistics. The conference room would be fitted with hidden audio and video recording devices. Daniel and 2 plainclothes police officers, already briefed on the situation, would be watching from the adjacent office via a live feed. The most difficult part of the plan fell to Lily. To make my surrender completely believable, she had to call them first. She had to play the part of the distraught, penitent daughter, telling them through tears that she had convinced her broken grandmother to finally see reason. The thought of putting her through that performance was agonizing, but she insisted. Her voice was firm when she told me, "They made me their puppet. It's only fair. I'm the one who cuts the strings." The night before we set the trap, I sat in my living room, watching the city lights twinkle below. Lily came and sat beside me, and we looked through an old photo album at pictures of her as a child, of Lucas, of my late husband. We were fighting for the truth of those memories. The next morning, my hand was perfectly steady as I dialed my son's number. I played my part, my voice weak and resigned. I heard the barely suppressed glee in Sabrina's tone as she agreed to the meeting. Friday morning, 10 o'clock. I hung up the phone and looked at Lily, who was watching me with wide, hopeful eyes. "The stage is set," I told her. My career had been spent preserving the past. For the first time, I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing I was about to curate the future. Their future. The day before the meeting was strangely serene. With the trap set and the players all assigned their roles, there was nothing left to do but wait. A tense calm settled over the house. Lily and I spent the afternoon in the garden, not talking much, just pruning roses and pulling weeds. The simple, physical work was grounding, a way to channel the nervous energy that hummed beneath the surface. With every weed I pulled, I felt like I was clearing away the decay that had infested my family, making way for whatever was to come next. We were 2 soldiers in a quiet truce with time, waiting for the dawn. That evening, Mrs. Chun called for one final briefing. Her voice was the steady, calm instrument of our righteous fury. She coached me on what I needed to accomplish in that room. It wasn't enough for them to accept the money. I had to get them to state their intentions on tape, in their own words. She gave me key phrases to use, innocent-sounding questions, designed to lead them down the path to their own conviction. I had to make them explain why they believed I was mentally unstable. I had to get them to admit the DNA test was the catalyst. I had to make them confirm that this transfer of assets was for my own protection. I felt like an actress learning her lines for the most important role of her life. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself in my late husband's study. The room was a sanctuary of memory, smelling faintly of his old books and the leather of his favorite chair. I was looking for a specific fountain pen he used to use, a pen I wanted to have with me for the signing. As I opened the top drawer of his desk, my fingers brushed against a small, loose panel at the back. Curious, I worked it free. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment I never knew existed, and inside was a single, sealed envelope addressed to me in his familiar, elegant script. My hands trembled as I opened it. It wasn't a will or a legal document. It was a letter written on our 20th wedding anniversary. He wrote about our life together, the challenges we'd overcome, the family we had built. But it was the last paragraph that made me sink into his chair. the paper clutched in my hands. He wrote that he never worried about the future because he was leaving our family and our legacy in the hands of the strongest, most intuitive person he had ever known. He wrote that my integrity was the bedrock of our family and that he knew, no matter what happened, I would always be its fierce protector. He had ended the letter with a simple line, "You were always the curator of our life, my love. Protect the collection." Tears streamed down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation, of strength. It was as if he was in the room with me, giving me his blessing. The letter was more than a memory. It was a mandate. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for him, for the life we built, for the legacy he had entrusted to me. The next morning, I got ready with a chilling sense of purpose. I chose a charcoal gray dress, elegant and severe. It was the color of stone. I placed my husband's letter carefully in my handbag, its presence a tangible weight against my side. I was no longer an actress playing a part. I was a protector defending her territory. Lily was waiting for me downstairs, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. We didn't need to say anything. We drove to Mrs. Chun's office in silence, the city moving past the windows in a blur. As we pulled up to the curb in front of the tall glass building, the final vestiges of fear and doubt fell away from me, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The performance was about to begin. The audience was waiting. Walking into Mrs. Chun's conference room felt like stepping onto a stage. The air was cool and still. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city bustled on. Oblivious Mrs. Chun was already seated at the head of the long, polished table, a single folder in front of her. She gave Lily a small, reassuring nod, and my granddaughter went to sit in a chair against the far wall. A silent observer, her presence our secret weapon. I took my seat opposite Mrs. Chun, my hands clasped on the table to still there, trembling. I knew that somewhere in the walls, hidden lenses were watching. The show was about to begin. Lucas and Sabrina arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. They entered the room radiating an aura of victory. Sabrina was wearing a cream-colored power suit, her smile bright and sharp. Lucas looked less confident but was clearly relieved, like a man who had finally reached the end of a long, unpleasant task. They greeted Mrs. Chun with professional courtesy and then turned to me with practiced sympathy. Sabrina placed a hand on my shoulder, telling me how proud she was of me for making this brave and necessary decision. The condescension in her touch made my skin crawl. They took their seats opposite me. The documents were already laid out on the table, a neat stack of papers that represented the complete surrender of my life. I picked up my late husband's fountain pen, its weight cool and solid in my hand. Then I looked up, letting my eyes fill with perfectly rehearsed tears, my voice catching in my throat. I told them that before I signed, for my own peace of mind, I just needed to hear it from them one more time. I needed to understand why we were here. Sabrina's smile was patient, like one you would give to a confused child. She launched into the performance of a lifetime. She told me, in a soft, soothing voice that was being recorded in crystal-clear audio, that this was an act of love. She recounted the trauma of the DNA discovery and my subsequent emotional collapse at the party. She reminded me of my confusion and distress in the days that followed. She and Lucas had been so worried, she explained, that they had consulted with professionals who had advised them that a person in my compromised state should not be burdened with complex financial decisions. To seal their fate, I gave them the prompt Mrs. Chun had prepared for me. I looked at Lucas, my own son, and asked him directly, my voice a pathetic whisper, if he truly believed I was mentally unstable. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting away, but he nodded. He told me it wasn't my fault, that the shock had just been too much for me. Sabrina took over again, explaining that signing the papers would create a legal and financial cocoon around me, allowing them to manage my estate and protect me from myself. She gestured to the papers, her voice dripping with false compassion, telling me it was the only way to ensure my legacy was safe. It was a breathtaking monologue of greed disguised as concern, and they were delivering it to a hidden audience of police officers. They thought they were at the finish line. They had no idea they were standing on a trapdoor. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting their damning words settle. I looked from Sabrina's smug face to my son's guilty one. Then, I turned my gaze to Mrs. Chun and gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. Mrs. Chun raised her hand, a quiet, simple gesture that cut through Sabrina's speech like a guillotine. "Thank you, Sabrina," she said, her voice devoid of all warmth. "I believe we have everything we need." Confusion flickered across Sabrina's face, turning her smile into a brittle line. Before she could ask what was going on, the conference room door opened. It wasn't a secretary with coffee, it was Daniel Ortiz, and flanking him were two serious-looking police officers. Daniel was holding a file that I knew contained a copy of the forged DNA test, the financial reports on their failed business, and a full transcript of their conspiracy. The color drained from Sabrina's face. She looked like she had been turned to stone, her mouth slightly agape. Lucas physically recoiled in his chair, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply, horribly satisfying to watch. The hunters had just realized they were the ones in the cage. In that moment, as their world shattered, I felt all the feigned weakness fall away from me like a cloak. I pushed my chair back and stood up, feeling a surge of power, of pure, righteous anger course through my veins for the first time in weeks. I was no longer a victim. I was a judge. I looked directly at my son. My voice, when I spoke, was not the shaky whisper of a moment ago. It was as cold and hard as marble. "You are my son, Lucas," I said, the words dropping into the dead silence of the room. "I gave you life, but you and your wife stood here today and tried to erase 38 years of that life. You tried to steal my home, my memories, and my mind, all for the sake of money." Sabrina started to stammer, a string of incoherent denials, but the sound was drowned out as one of the officers stepped forward. He informed them they were being arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud. In the deafening silence, the only sound was the soft, final click of handcuffs. It was the sound of justice. After the handcuffs clicked shut and they were led away, the silence they left behind in that conference room was immense. It was the sound of a 30-year-old life, my life as a mother to my son, ending. Lily came and wrapped her arms around me, and for a long time, we just stood there, holding each other up. The battle was over, but the war had left scars that would take a long time to fade. The justice that followed was as swift and brutal as their betrayal. With the video and audio recordings from that room, coupled with Daniel's evidence and Lily Essie Bravey testimony, their case was indefensible. The story became a local scandal, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and country clubs where they had once been so admired. Their carefully constructed world of illusion crumbled into dust. They were convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Their house, the cars, every last designer bag Sabrina owned it, was all sold off to pay their legal fees and the debts from their failed business. I saw Lucas one last time on the day of his sentencing. Across the courtroom, our eyes met. I searched his face for any flicker of the little boy I had raised, any hint of remorse, but there was nothing. Only a hollowed-out resentment. He didn't see a mother he had betrayed. He saw the person whose money he had failed to steal. And in that cold, empty gaze, I finally accepted the truth. The son I had loved existed only in my memories. The man sitting there was a stranger. And so, with a quiet, heartbreaking finality, I let him go. In the months that followed, Lily and I built a new life from the ashes of the old one. We filled the quiet house with new routines. We cooked together. We gardened. We spent evenings watching old movies, our presence a silent comfort to each other. We were two branches of the same tree that had been nearly torn apart by a storm. Now slowly, carefully, growing back together, stronger and more intertwined than before. She started her art history degree, and I found a joy I hadn't felt in years, sharing my knowledge and my passion with her. We were healing, but I knew my own healing needed something more. It needed purpose. The $500,000 from Lily's trust, the money that had served as the bait for their entire monstrous plan, sat in a bank account, feeling tainted and heavy. I couldn't let it be a monument to their greed. It had to become a testament to my survival. So, I started a foundation. I used that money and a good portion of my own, to create a nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to protecting senior citizens from the very kind of financial and emotional abuse I had endured. My life as an art curator was over, but I found I had a new collection to protect: the lives and legacies of people who, like me, had been targeted because their predators mistook their age for weakness. I went from preserving paintings to preserving people. And in that work, I found a peace that justice alone could not provide. Looking back, the pain of what my son did will never completely disappear. It's a part of my story now, a dark thread woven into the tapestry of my life. But it is not the whole picture. I learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that blood can be thinner than the ink on a forged signature. I learned that the family you are born into is a matter of chance, but the family you fight for is a matter of choice. The real strength isn't in the bonds we inherit, it's in the ones we refuse to let break. Thank you for hearing my story to the very end. Sharing such a painful part of my life isn't easy, but it feels less heavy knowing you were here with me. If you believe stories like this are important and want to hear other tales of justice and survival, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It would also give me great comfort to know where my friends in this journey are. If you're willing, please let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. Your support means more than you know.